Welcome to the Story Partners Podcast. I'm Annie Manus, and we're so glad you found us.
They didn't care about what my history or past had looked like. And I think at the time they were just looking for someone who was available to have a good time and to take risks and go cross the line, honestly. They gave me approval. They made me feel accepted and seen, and they acted like they wanted me a part of their friend group. Nothing dignifying or God-honoring happened that summer, but it gave me a false sense, but nonetheless a sense of belonging.
With a very messy family life, Simone Halpin was looking for love and acceptance. She found it in a group of guys who did not have her best interests in mind. This week, we have another two-part story for you. In this first episode, you're going to hear how God used the traumatic situations from Simone's past to prepare her for the work he would call her to do. This is Season 2, Episode 11, Part 1, Exploited.
Divorce was a major theme in my childhood. My mom and my dad were each other's second marriages. They were already bringing in brokenness, broken marriages. I have very little memories of anything being clear growing up. So from early on, it was confusing why there was violence in my home. It was confusing why there were times where police would show up, and it was confusing why my dad would tell my mom he wasn't drinking, and then she'd go out of town and he would drink. It was confusing why I'd spent extended amount of time with neighbors and not know why. Or my mom or my dad wouldn't come home at night. I mean, there was so much confusion. Lots of tears, and I remember always feeling like I just had to keep the peace. That felt like my role in our family, was not to upset anybody or fall out of line. It was a bit of a survival, like you were just really trying to get through each day. I started to see the major discrepancy between what was happening in my family behind closed doors versus friends that I had, and what I thought their families looked like, and how different things at least looked from the outside. My mom left my dad, and I honestly think she did the best she could for him by getting him into treatment, because he's been sober ever since, which is a miracle. But she put him in treatment, and then she files for divorce, and then she makes plans and she moves across the country. I mean, it's a massive move, sells her business that she was running in Minnesota, gets a job in Dallas, where she's from, moves me and my brother across the country, and we move directly into an apartment of the man she's dating. I'm leaving what I had known as a community as an 8-year-old. I moved halfway across the country, and my brother and I are sharing a bedroom in a 2-bedroom apartment of a man who I met once or twice, and now we're living with him. So I look back at that and think, oh my gosh, like as a parent, that would be a tough decision to make, and or was she thinking, about our best interest? I'm not sure. Both my parents remarried shortly after they got divorced, and so I inherited 3 stepbrothers and a stepsister at one point. 2 of those stepbrothers are no longer stepbrothers. There was another divorce, and I'm still in touch with my younger stepbrother. He's just an amazing guy with a sweet family, and then I have a stepsister who I've only met once or twice. I have an older brother, and he and I separated when I was in middle school-ish. He moved back to Minnesota and finished high school and college. Both my stepmom and my stepdad were on their second and third marriages when they married my parents. And this is bonkers, but my mom was in the wedding of my stepdad's first marriage. It is hard to track. So when I say by the time I was 11 or 12 years old and there were 11 marriages and divorces in my family history, that again is a big definition of what my childhood looked like. Just brokenness and lack of vision of marriage and commitment. I longed for something to say, this is your family unit and it's your safe place. As much as I knew my parents loved me, nobody was looking out for me saying, here's what we see in you, here are gifts we see in you, here's how we feel like God's created you, and pointing me and steering me. And again, as a parent today, I know how much kids crave that, how much they long for someone to pull out their strengths and point them in a direction that will send them into a life that's flourishing and productive. So I think I just figured out a way to do it on my own. I definitely learned survival skills at an early age. I learned independence of minor things that I look back and say, gosh, my kids couldn't even do this today. But things like enrolling myself into my high school, my freshman year. I got my driver's license at the age of 15 instead of 16 through a hardship, but I applied for the whole process on my own and stood before a judge. I don't think I thought, no one's gonna take care of me, I have to take care of myself. I think it was just instinctual. I think that I looked around and thought, you just have to make the best of what's in front of you. Entering into my junior year of high school was probably when things had just gotten to a new point. I had very little parental guidance or accountability. And so I, deep within my spirit, probably knew what was right and wrong. And I had spent an extended amount of time in Minnesota visiting my dad and my stepmom and stepbrothers. And I got kind of swept up in this experience of feeling really loved and cared for by a group of older teenage boys and their friends, people who didn't really know me. So they didn't have a label for me, or they didn't care about what my history or past had looked like. And I think at the time they were just looking for someone who was available to have a good time and to take risks and go cross the line, honestly. And because I was so willing, I was craving their favor. I was craving friendship, which of course wasn't at all friendship. But at the moment it felt like it was. And it's as classic as it comes. They gave me approval. They made me feel accepted and seen, and they acted like they wanted me a part of their friend group. And so I felt accepted, and I felt cool and wanted. And that was something that had not been fulfilled in a tangible way within my nuclear family that I could recall. I'm sure I had moments of it growing up, but for the most part, as a teenager, my brain firing off all directions, developing and trying to figure out my purpose in the world, I was vulnerable at that time for anyone to say, we love you, we want you part of our group, even though none of it was not love and it was not true. I put myself in some vulnerable places and times. I had made some poor decisions. I experimented with drinking, and I experienced a sexual assault that summer that I look back and recognize was zero fault of my own. But at the time it felt very confusing and very hurtful. What made it confusing was that two of the guys in the group were my stepbrothers. And so I looked to them as family, and they're older than me, they're taking care of me, they care about me, but they were introducing me to people who didn't care, who had awful motives. They were looking to take advantage of people. They were looking to put girls like me in vulnerable and compromising situations so that we would, quote unquote, say yes, and that we would lose inhibition and we wouldn't have, the sense or the strength to say no. And so that happened in many different ways. It wasn't always physical or sexual, but it happened in being encouraged and pushed beyond my boundaries of what I was comfortable with, even with substances or things we were experimenting with, places we would go, the time of day we would go out, driving cars that didn't belong to. I mean, like the amount of trouble that we could have gotten in that summer was mind-blowing. I don't mean to exaggerate in the sense that I am probably lucky to be alive after some of the things that we said and did that summer, the way we pushed the boundaries and the limits. Nothing dignifying or God-honoring happened that summer, but it gave me a false sense, but nonetheless a sense of belonging. I clung to it. I was willing to sever the relationship with my mom for the rest of my life in that moment, thinking that this is where I belonged and that they cared about me. So I tried to leave. I tried to move from Dallas, from my mom's house, and I had said I want to move in with Dad. These are my friends now. This is where I want to finish high school. And for whatever reason, my mom would not let me. She put her foot down, and as a mom now, I think back how incredibly hurtful I was to her for this extended period of time where I was threatening to not come home, and eventually I have to get on a flight, and I come home, and then I sat in class for 2 weeks of the start of my junior year and refused to take notes. I remember specifically my Spanish class being like, I'm moving. I'm not gonna take any notes in this class. And for 2 weeks, this intense conflict just kept getting worse and worse at home. And I kept saying, I'm leaving. I couldn't get on a plane on my own, so I had a very weak argument, but I was just threatening. I was saying hurtful, awful things to my mom, and she just stood her ground. And we weren't close, so it was confusing to me. Where has she been my whole life? Why is she fighting for me now? It felt too late. I didn't realize that any sort of abuse happened until much later. And I didn't even want to allow myself to admit, which is so typical of victims. You don't want to admit loss of agency. It feels worse than, it can feel worse, the admission of loss of agency, than the actual incident itself. Because the emotional bond is called a trauma bond, and it's very similar to the Stockholm syndrome, where you believe the person who is abusing you cares about you, and the abuse is a byproduct of what you think is a healthy relationship. And you have to go through a long process of healing it's honestly rewiring of the brain to understand that relationship is not healthy, that he doesn't care for you, that he doesn't, the promises that he's giving you and it's all false. It's based off of lies and manipulation. And to admit that loss of agency in that relationship, a victim towards her abuser, like I said, is harder often than the abuse itself. What I experienced was awful and traumatic, and I would never want that for anyone. But for some reason, I had the resources and some capacity to be able to keep going, and it didn't send me into a tailspin, which often happens when there's abuse. And I think the only difference is that for whatever reason, the Lord's sovereignty and faithfulness showed itself to me shortly after. And sometimes it's longer for other people. And so for me, that was his timing for my life. Up until that point, I wasn't the one causing conflict in my home. I was just avoiding it or trying to put things back together. I wasn't ever the reason for it. And so this role overwhelmed me. I thought, what have I done? I have turned everything upside down. My dad's threatening legal action. My mom's not speaking to me. She's so hurt by my words. I'm longing for a community in Minnesota that is hurtful and harmful to me. And I had that conflicting. I know that's wrong, but why do I desire that? It was all of these just heavy and intense emotions. There was a night that I fell to my knees in my room, my bedroom, and I cried out to God. And I said, if you will take away everything I've done, all the hurt and pain that I've caused my family in the last couple of weeks, I will surrender. I will surrender to you. I will give you my life. I just need you to fix this. The Lord met me in that night in my room, and I woke up the next morning and my mom and I reconciled. And it was an act of God, truly, that she was able to forgive me. She's really good at holding grudges. And she forgave me that next morning, and we reconciled. And it was just after that whole experience that I met this group of girls. I was still very much lost entering into my junior year of high school. And at this point, I'm 16 and able to make a lot more of my own decisions and very little parental guidance or accountability. And so I was right. I had one foot in and one foot out of morality, of what I thought was moral. And a girlfriend, she invited me to church our junior year of high school, where I met a handful of girls who I'm still best friends with to this day. They just, I don't know why they liked me, but they were so kind to me and they welcomed me into their lives. And I started going to church on my own. I wasn't sharing anything and everything with them at first, but I had enough to keep a conversation interesting, based on my years of, trauma from divorce and alcoholism and other things. I felt like I could be myself. They didn't do anything to make me feel like I had to be a certain way or I was going to get kicked out. They were the picture and continue to be of just unconditional love, acceptance, come as you are, nothing you can say or do will scare us. I had the false belief that if I did say too much or if I did let too many skeletons out of my closet, that they would reject me. But it wasn't them giving off, it wasn't these girls giving off this impression that I had to be a certain way and that they had a bar that I had to reach. That was not the case. The case was I had grown up with so much instability that I didn't know what unconditional love looked like. And I had to learn that. I met a couple who were my Sunday school teachers that year who became spiritual parents to me, and again, still are to this day. And now they're like spiritual grandparents to my kids, where my kids spend time with them, even on their own, which is just amazing. It's such a gift to us. So it was through relationships with my girlfriends and then this church in First Baptist Church of Colleyville, Texas, where I was just welcomed in. I just jumped in. It was like sink or swim at this point. I was really on the brink of kind of going two different directions in my life. And at the right time, the Lord used people and community in this church to just love me and welcome me. And I have honestly been walking with the Lord ever since I was 17 in my junior year of high school. It took years for me to even process and admit what had happened and where I needed the Lord to come and bring healing to me. It took years for that. And I talked to people, the Baileys, who I mentioned, the kind of the spiritual parents and mentors in my life, I talked to them about anything. And if you would have asked me at 17, 18 years old, what did I need the most coaching and counseling on with stable people, I had a long list. And so the sexual assault wasn't number one on the list, which is, even saying that, I'm like, that's crazy. But there was a lot there. There was, 16 years of confusion, instability, and those are all years of development. And so learning, and like I didn't have the words at the time, but allowing my brain to catch up developmentally with the world around me, that took time. And so I had a lot of things to talk to people about. There was just so many. The list was so long that I think in God's timing, I was able to come to terms with what that list was and how long it actually was, and received a lot of constant affirmation that no matter what had been done to me or what decisions I had made on my own accord, that it didn't tarnish or change God's love for me. I consistently heard that, so much so that I started to believe it. And when you can believe that God's love for you is as deep and as wide as your brain can allow you to imagine, there's nothing that gives you more stability than that. So I think my journey to process not just the sexual assault, but the years of other childhood trauma, that journey for me became, I was able to find healing because I was so focused on learning about God's care for me. And the more I learned that, the healing was kind of organic in that way. The Lord used the lives of these girls and my spiritual mentors to give me that belonging. And I learned everything that you think about when you do discipleship. I learned how to read the Bible. I learned how to be faithful to church on Sundays. I learned how to serve through mission trips and different ways to serve in the community. I pushed against who to date because I'd had a history of dating whoever I wanted. Like, someone liked me, then let's go out. Whereas my standards were like slowly starting to shift, and I struggled with that, obviously. I remember this group of Christian girlfriends questioning me and a guy I was dating kind of on and off my junior and senior year, and they wondered if he was a believer, and that was a whole new ballgame for me. What does that mean, and how do I know, and what if he's not? I met my husband in college. We kind of fumbled our way through what does it look like to be in a Christian relationship, and how do we honor each other in our faith but not lose sight of our own growing in sanctification. So we kind of stumbled our way through that the next 4 years of college. But, in God's sovereignty and his timing for our lives, it worked out. We got married in 2003, and when Anthony proposed, it was will you marry me and move to Chicago? Because he had already accepted a job out of college. He knew he was moving, and obviously I knew that if he asked me to marry him, that's where we were going. So we did. We were so thrilled with the opportunity to move to Chicago, and we lived in the city. There was a ton of women in particular at our church who were so eager to do something significant and meaningful for the gospel to other women who were outside of our church. We'd spend an hour at minimum praying for the night ahead. And then when we were ready, when we felt the Spirit would lead, we'd get in this massive white church van that had a big magnet on the side that said Rose of Sharon, a ministry of this church in Humble Park. And we would drive around. We wouldn't have to go far. At this point, it's like midnight or later. And we would see women who were selling their bodies on the streets. And we would get out. We would approach in a pair, there'd be two of us, and we'd have a gift bag, or sometimes we'd have a rose as the actual, the literal title of the ministry, Rose of Sharon, and we would just approach this woman and say, do you have any prayer needs tonight? We are out here to pray for you. Is there anything we can pray for you about? And until I was trained by doing this several times, I would just observe, and I would just be like the third person in that triangle, and I would just be praying silently while the other woman who was trained to have the conversations and to pray with women would lead that. And I can't think of many times where women said no. They always seemed to gravitate to this conversation. And I look back and now I know that those conversations we would have with women on the streets would be the most dignified conversations she would have that entire day. So she would gravitate toward us and gladly share her prayer requests, which were everything from pray for my kids who I don't have custody of, or pray for my addiction, I want God to heal me, or pray I find somewhere to sleep tonight. I mean, they were very, you're here to pray, I'm taking full advantage of that. You have an in with God, I am telling you everything, so maybe you can help me. And it was hard at first because we would pray and we'd give her her rose or we'd give her her gift bag and then we'd walk away, and I'm thinking, we didn't do anything. Like, she's still very much homeless right now. And she's about to get into a car with a stranger who knows what he's gonna do to her. And it felt very unsettling. But I had to trust this ministry who had been doing this for years, that this was their calling. Their calling was to offer prayer to these women at this time of night and trust that something would happen in this woman's life. At this point, I had done enough outreach that they were letting me lead the prayer and the conversation. And I approached a woman and asked the same thing, would you like prayer tonight? We're here to pray. Do you have any prayer needs? And she looked at me, and then she looked to the street. And the second I had kind of engaged in conversation, a car drove up, and it was a buyer. And so he rolled down his window. And when I say buyer, he was inquiring about purchasing her for like a 30-minute window of sex. He would pay her. And then what I know now is that majority of women who are selling their bodies on the streets are being controlled by a trafficker. So she would get to keep that money, she would give it to her trafficker, and then go right back out and have to do that again, night after night after night. So I engage in this conversation with her. The buyer pulls up, he rolls down her window, and they start to have a conversation. She's like leaning through his car window door. And she turns back at me as if to say, I'm getting in. And she opens the door. She never says anything to me. She opens the door and she has one foot in the car and she has one foot on the curb. And this is not what you're supposed to do. But in that moment, I think something just came over me and I sort of lunged at her. I didn't touch her, but I kind of went toward her in this eagerness to save her. And I said, you don't have to do this. And she just turned around at me, and her eyes said everything, which was, yes, I do. And she communicated to me without saying a word, I do have to do this. You have no idea what my life is like. You don't know what's going to happen to me when I get into this car. You don't know what's going to happen to me when this appointment is over. You don't know what my life looks like. You know nothing about me. And if you did, you would know that I had to do this. I mean, that is everything she communicated to me. And she got in the car, shut the door, and she drove off. And I was paralyzed. I thought, what in the world? How did she get here? How? She was my age. At this point, I was pregnant with my third when this was happening. And I thought, how in the world do we live such different lives in the same city? How is this happening? And this is not okay. I don't know what he's gonna do to her. I don't know how many times a day this has happened to her. I don't know how violated she is, both physically but emotionally. Where is God in all of this? I mean, I had so many questions, and I just knew to my core that what was happening to her was not okay and that something had to be done. And that flipped a switch. That was a turning point in my life, and I could not stop talking about it. And God's plan in his heart, because he cares for women who are being exploited more than I ever will be able to, had the next step. And then he had the next step after that, and the next step after that. And that's really how Naomi's house was birthed. That was the night that I knew things could never be the same.
Although Simone knew struggles and heartache in her early years, God was calling her out as one of his own. I love how God met her in her deepest wounds through community, both the spiritual parents that she talks about, but also this group of women who just unconditionally accepted her and loved her. It's so beautiful how God often loves us through other people that he surrounds us with. and it's through those relationships that he begins to heal and restore our broken places.
There are certainly levels of difference of abuse and exploitation. What we see at Naomi's house is the worst. It is the most complex. It is the most traumatic. It is straight out of the pit of hell, what the women at Naomi's house have gone through and are experiencing, and how they are literally climbing their way out of that abuse to find hope to live a stable life again.
After being exposed to this world of commercial sexual exploitation, Simone goes all in on what God is inviting her into. Be sure to tune in 1 week from now when we share the rest of Simone's story in part 2 of Exploited.
Hi, my name is Blair and I'm from Austin, Texas. I love Story Partners because I have been captivated by stories, and I just love how God can use them to connect people and offer hope in the midst of hardship. This ministry has blessed me so much, and I pray that it does the same for you too. Story Partners is a nonprofit ministry that tells stories that point to Jesus. We tell these stories through short documentary films, as well as this podcast. We're a crowdfunded ministry funded by monthly giving from people like me. To learn more or to join our crowdfunding community, visit us at storypartners.org.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Story Partners podcast. This story was recorded and edited by Walt and Annie Manus. If you were encouraged by it, we hope you'll share it with a friend. We'll see you next time.